idea. Religion, philosophy, culture, even civilization, all felt the cold wind of an entirely new universe, one hitherto unimagined by humanity. The exalted species of Homo sapiens, God's favourite, the purpose of all creation, was suddenly reduced to an accidental product of evolutionary development. Very little would survive this hit-and-miss idea intact. Science, too, was forced to embark upon a profound re-examination of its foundations. Even mathematics was not immune. Perhaps the most poetically profound and satisfying philosophical conception of mathematics had been produced by the Arabs around the 8th century. In this view, to understand mathematics was to understand the mind of God. Almost 1,000 years later, Newton too believed this. The absence of a God at work in the world of evolution implied that the same was true of mathematics. But if so, where did mathematics actually exist? Did it exist in the world, or only in the minds of mathematicians? Was it our way of seeing the world, our imposition upon the undifferentiated flow of our experience? Or was 2 + 2 = 4 true, even when there were no minds to conceive of this? In what sense could mathematics be true when there was no such thing as numbers? Were mathematical truths somehow out there, waiting to be discovered, or did we construct them from basic axioms and definitions for which we ourselves were wholly responsible? Philosophers of mathematics are still arguing over this. In many ways, the plight of mathematics epitomized the condition of all knowledge in the new evolutionary era. Nothing any more had a divine external guarantee. Nothing would be the same in this brave new scientific world. Such problems would devastate much pre-Darwinian thinking. Schopenhauer's was perhaps the only philosophy that was actually deepened by Darwin. I may conceive of an individual willpower at work inside me, a will to survive that permeates my actions in a way of which I am often unaware, but when I view all living things in terms of Darwin's survival of the fittest, it is possible to understand that my individual willpower may well be a minor manifestation of some universal will. Here was no mere collective unconscious. Schopenhauer's will drove through the entire universe. Several of Schopenhauer's disciples seized upon Darwin as a confirmation of his philosophy of will. However, this argument is based upon a misunderstanding of Darwinian thought, and by implication a misconception of Schopenhauer too. Survival of the fittest does not necessarily include willpower of any sort, even in the most variegated, sublimated, or degraded form. Darwin's famous slogan simply describes what happens. It does not describe any force that makes it happen. Indeed, his description of how evolution happens would seem to be the very opposite of will of any sort. Darwin saw adaptation as the means of survival, blending in adaptation to circumstance, giving way, bending to the wind, rather than assertion, domination, conspicuousness, have arguably proved the most effective evolutionary methods. If there is any underlying principle that describes how the universe works, Schopenhauer's will would certainly not seem to fit the bill, except in one vital aspect, namely the ultimate indifference to humanity with which the universe operates. And in this, Schopenhauer was confirmed by Darwin. Schopenhauer saw this indifference as evil because it destroyed human good, operating as it did without regard for human morality. This will was certainly cold, unfeeling, inhuman, etc., but it was at bottom a morally neutral force. Good and evil, motive and action, belonged in the physical world, as Schopenhauer argued. His frequent stigmatization of the will as evil essentially contradicted his own argument. Schopenhauer was aware of this inconsistency, and suggested that the will was evil only insofar as it appeared as such to us. As Schopenhauer emphasizes, the only way we can know the will is through our inner apprehension of its role in our own lives. But if we can only know this will by introspection, then strictly speaking we cannot be said to know its central supporting or driving role in the world of phenomena. We are aware of only one tiny aspect of the will amidst an all-encompassing world of phenomena. This is essentially solipsism, the situation where I alone exist. Nothing else is real but my inner awareness of the will and my experience of phenomena. All philosophies have faced the difficulty of solipsism, a cul-de-sac out of which it is all but impossible to argue. In the most rigid sense, there is no escape from this lonely situation. Schopenhauer's philosophy also falls foul of such strictures, but his argument has its persuasive force nonetheless. I may not be able to prove that others have their own independent existence and element of will, or that they experience the world much as I do, but I can infer it. My experience, and the consistency of what appear to be their reactions to me, lead me to believe that I am encountering other beings like myself. With mental persistence, we can reduce ourselves to a state of solipsism, the scrupulously limited condition of the Beckett hero. This can prove both revealing and philosophically fruitful. How little we know for certain of the world and our life in it. But the habits of common sense soon return us to the so-called sane world of our fellow human beings. So far, so good. But Schopenhauer extends this inference from our introspection of will to the all-pervasive will. As we have seen, notions such as the unconscious mind and evolution lend some weight to this argument. But such notions were not available to Schopenhauer when he created his philosophy. As a result, his limited, strictly philosophical argument is less convincing. Here, it appears, the exceptional prescience of his understanding outstripped his ability to explain what he felt to be true. Intuition preceded analysis. The reader is convinced on the poetic rather than the philosophical level, and this was certainly true of those contemporaries who embraced Schopenhauer's philosophy during the last years of his fame. Schopenhauer had discovered a poetic truth that found considerable psychological rapport, but as an intellectually arguable truth it remained ahead of its time. Be this as it may, Schopenhauer proceeds to base his entire philosophy upon this central notion of the will which permeates all things. It is seen as evil or indifferent to humanity, and as such is the origin of suffering in the world. The world is thus essentially evil or indifferent to us, a place of irredeemable misery illuminated with occasional flashes of horror. Here Schopenhauer's misanthropic streak comes into its own. Not for nothing would he become known one day as the philosopher of pessimism. His vision of the world was one of sophisticated, remote, and often highly witty distaste. For long passages he revels in the stupidity of human behavior, uncovering with acute psychological acumen the hypocrisy and self-centeredness that lie at the root of so much human activity. All such things, and such things were all, were manifestations of the will. This was what drove the world. The only way to escape from this deluge of wickedness was to lessen its force within oneself, to overcome this will that drives the appetites and desires, the lusts of the flesh and ambition. Self-abnegation and withdrawal from life were the only answer. The sole effective attitude to life and the multifarious manifestations of the will was withdrawal into a stoic asceticism. Here the influence of Oriental religion on Schopenhauer's philosophy is plain to see. The religionless religion of Buddhism carries much the same message. Similar thinking permeates the wisdom of the Hindu sages. But there is a subtle difference between Schopenhauer's advice and the goal of such Oriental religion. The ascetic withdrawal that he urges is all but identical, though his encouragement to will-less contemplation of works of art is not precisely the same as meditating on a lotus blossom. But it is the way Schopenhauer urges this denial of will that differentiates it from the wisdom of the East. Schopenhauer's tone of voice is always unmistakably his own. He never loses his style. His writing remains worldly, sophisticated, and witty at all times. What is missing is the spirituality of the East. Schopenhauer's Stoicism harks back to the Stoicism that developed among the intellectual upper class of the late Roman Empire, during its more disgraceful periods of bloodletting, sensual viciousness, and imperial degeneracy. Schopenhauer's is the world-weariness and disgust of the toga rather than the loincloth. He may appear to advocate much the same behavior, but following this course will bring about no redeeming spiritual enlightenment. The will-less contemplation of a work of art may give us a momentary aesthetic experience, but this is hardly a vision of nirvana. We must withdraw from the hideous manifestation of the will for the sake of self-preservation, which is at the same time a form of self-destruction. Our only reward is the meagre understanding that the will is utterly evil and functions as a nasty joke at our expense. The end product Schopenhauer often seems to have in mind is an austere gentleman who frequents the art galleries, rather than a skeletal mystic. And indeed, this frugal, gentlemanly figure is very much how Schopenhauer saw himself. Alas, the facts paint a rather different picture. Throughout his life, Schopenhauer lived in bourgeois comfort, denying himself few of the normal accoutrements of such a well-heeled, leisurely existence. His suits were hand-tailored from the finest materials, he ate in restaurants, and he enjoyed the company of good-looking young women. Not for one moment did he contemplate giving up his private income for any saintly existence without a housekeeper. He continued to have love affairs of a most unexalted nature, and he enjoyed eating large meals. As he once replied to an inquisitive dining companion, "Sir, true, I eat 3 times as much as you, but I have 3 times as much brains as you." Yet he did find time to submit himself to regular bouts of will-less aesthetic appreciation. He was keen on literature, going to concerts and art galleries, and often visited the theatre, and not just to pick up chorus girls. Schopenhauer had very definite ideas on art, and wrote a great deal on the subject. In his view, the highest form of art was music, which descended through poetry to its lowest form in architecture. Light romantic novels, such as those of Johanna Schopenhauer, do not appear on this artistic scale. When Schopenhauer finished The World as Will and Representation, he sent the manuscript to a publisher with a characteristically bashful covering note. "This book, in times to come, will be the source and occasion of 100 other books." As it happens, this turned out to be an extremely modest underestimation, but not to begin with. For many years, decades even, Schopenhauer's work was spectacularly unsuccessful. 16 years later, the publishers finally informed Schopenhauer that almost all of the small first edition of his masterpiece had been pulped as waste paper. Schopenhauer's reaction to this lack of acclaim from his contemporaries was typical. Would a musician be flattered by the loud applause of an audience if he knew that they were nearly all deaf? But this humiliation and acerbic forbearance all lay in the future. Confident of fame now that he had delivered his masterpiece to the publishers, Schopenhauer embarked on a long holiday in Italy. Before setting out, he had written to Goethe, who had sent him a letter of introduction to Byron. The maverick British poet was living in Venice at the time, which happened to be on Schopenhauer's itinerary. While Schopenhauer was walking along the Lido with a woman he had picked up, Byron happened to gallop past on his horse. The woman shrieked and passed into a rapture at the sight of the great romantic hero. Schopenhauer, stricken with jealousy, decided against using his letter of introduction from Goethe. In years to come, Schopenhauer was to cite this as an instance of women preventing mankind from greatness. Schopenhauer continued wandering through Italy for a year, irritating the international artists' colony and the Café Greco in Rome with his provocative opinions, advocating polytheism, referring to the apostles as 12 Philistines from Jerusalem, etc., and writing home that in Italy he enjoyed not only her beauty, but also her beauties. In 1819, The World as Will and Representation was published. This not only contained Schopenhauer's entire system in almost finished form, but was to be the pinnacle of his thought, which was not to develop further in any significant way during the ensuing 40 years of his life. By 1820, Schopenhauer was beginning to become distinctly impatient at his lack of world fame. He decided to take matters into his own hands, and secured a post as Privatdozent at the University of Berlin, where Hegel was teaching. Hegel had now settled like a thick blanket of snow over the green fields and woodlands of German philosophy. Nothing of the real landscape was visible beneath this muffling, colourless shroud of obscurity, and philosophers had been reduced to creating quaint snowmen, lobbing dialectical snowballs at one another, and skating skilfully across the frozen ponds of abstraction. The world flocked to hear Santa Claus deliver his lectures. Schopenhauer spotted at once that his rival to the philosophic heavyweight title of Germany was a phony, and announced that he would deliver his lectures at precisely the same time as Hegel's. Schopenhauer was flabbergasted when no one turned up. To console himself, after delivering his solipsistic lectures, he took up with a 19-year-old actress called Caroline Medon. This was just the kind of delightful young person he was looking for, he decided, and began contemplating marriage, though without informing Caroline.